Imagine, just for a moment, sitting in a park that's been your peaceful retreat for over 30 years. The sun is rising, the birds are chirping, and the world is slowly waking up around you. You've done this 1,000 times before, finding solace in the morning air. But today something's different. A young officer approaches you, demanding to know if you belong here. Your heart starts to race. How would you feel if your serene morning, one you've enjoyed for decades, suddenly spirals into a confrontation? A confrontation fueled by nothing more than your appearance. And what happens when that officer discovers the truth about the man he's trying to intimidate? Trust me, this is a story that will leave you breathless. Justice, karma, and a revelation that no one saw coming. But before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It was a crisp morning in Trenton, Tennessee. The kind of morning that makes you stop and just breathe. The sun, just beginning to rise, filtered through the towering oaks in Grant Park, casting long, graceful shadows over the ground. It was quiet, peaceful, almost a rarity in the fast-paced world we live in. At the heart of it all, sitting on a time-worn wooden bench, was Raymond Brooks. His hands, calloused and weathered from years of hard work, cradled a warm cup of coffee. His salt and pepper hair, neatly cropped in a style reminiscent of his days in the military, framed his face. Despite the passage of time, his back remained straight, a testament to his enduring strength. He glanced down at the folded newspaper resting in his lap, part of his daily ritual: coffee, the news, and the slow unraveling of another day. For nearly 30 years, Raymond had started each day the same way, quietly observing the park as the world woke up around him. A jogger would pass by, a couple would stroll by with their dog, and Raymond would nod or smile in greeting, always returning the warmth. But this morning, there was something in the air, a tension that made him uneasy, even though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The park was mostly empty, with only a few early risers scattered about. As Raymond took another slow sip of his coffee, something caught his eye. A figure, an officer, was walking through the entrance. Raymond didn't think much of it at first. Trenton was a small town, and the police were familiar faces. But this officer was new. Officer David Clark, fresh out of the academy, eager to make his mark, moving with a sense of authority that felt just a bit too much for the occasion. Raymond noticed the officer's eyes scanning the park, eventually settling on him, sitting alone on his bench. That familiar, uneasy feeling gripped Raymond's chest. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but there was something in the officer's eyes, a look he had seen far too many times before. Officer Clark walked toward him, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel path, each step adding to the tension building in the air. Raymond kept his eyes on his newspaper, hoping the officer would just pass by, but no such luck. "Good morning," the officer said, his voice firm, but carrying an edge that made it sound less like a greeting and more like an accusation. Raymond looked up and gave a polite smile. "Morning." But the officer wasn't smiling. He stood a few feet away, hands resting on his utility belt, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here, sir?" The question hung in the air, sharp and direct. Raymond, confused, responded, "Just enjoying my coffee. Been coming to this park for years." The officer didn't seem convinced. His eyes continued to scan Raymond, sizing him up as though searching for something to justify his growing suspicion. Then came the next question, cold and disbelieving. "Do you live around here?" Raymond nodded, his smile beginning to fade. "I live a few blocks away. Been here for more than 30 years. This is my neighborhood." For a moment, Officer Clark seemed to hesitate, like he was processing Raymond's words. But it wasn't long before he fired off his next demand. "Do you have any ID on you?" Raymond's brows furrowed in disbelief. "ID?" His voice was steady, but now laced with confusion. "I'm not sure why I'd need that. I'm just sitting here, minding my own business." The officer's lips thinned into a straight line. "I need to verify that you belong in this neighborhood," he said, his voice growing even more authoritative. "We've had some issues lately." Raymond's jaw clenched. That old frustration began to bubble up, the kind that had lived in his chest for years. The kind he thought he had buried, but now it surged back to the surface. He had lived through segregation, been told time and time again where he could and couldn't go. And now, here he was, in his own neighborhood, being questioned like a criminal, again. But Raymond wasn't the young man he used to be. His fight wasn't what it once was. It was more exhaustion now, more weariness from decades of enduring these very things. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I've been sitting on this bench long before you were even born. I don't think I need to prove anything." For a moment, the officer looked taken aback, almost startled. But it didn't last long. He stepped closer, his hand resting on his holster now. His next words came out low, threatening. "Sir, I'm going to need you to show me some identification." Raymond felt the heat of the confrontation rising. The tension between them was palpable now. People had started to gather, slowing their pace as they passed by, watching, but no one stepped forward yet. Raymond stood slowly, using his cane to support his aging body. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he sure wasn't going to let this officer push him around. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer," he said quietly, meeting the officer's gaze. "But I'm not about to let you treat me like a criminal for sitting in a park." The standoff was thick with anticipation. Officer Clark's grip on his authority was slipping, and Raymond wasn't backing down. Then, just as the situation was about to escalate, a new figure entered the scene. A calm, steady presence. From behind a row of tall hedges, a retired schoolteacher named Kelvin Williams emerged. He had been sitting nearby, quietly enjoying his morning, but the sight of Officer Clark looming over Raymond was too much. Kelvin stood, his broad shoulders and calm demeanor cutting through the tension like a hot knife through butter. Kelvin approached, his steps soft on the gravel path, and as he came into view, Raymond let out a silent sigh of relief. The officer, however, hadn't noticed him yet. Kelvin's voice was firm, but calm as he asked, "Is there a problem here, officer?" The weight of his years of experience showed in his steady tone. The officer, surprised by the interruption, shifted his attention to Kelvin, his annoyance evident. "This is none of your concern, sir," Clark snapped. "Please step back." But Kelvin didn't back down. Instead, he took a step closer, positioning himself near Raymond, hands loose and visible to avoid any misunderstanding. "It's my concern now," he said, his voice unwavering. "I've been sitting over there for a while, and I couldn't help but overhear the conversation." The tension was now electric, crackling in the air between the three men. And just as things seemed about to boil over, another voice rang out, deep, commanding, and filled with authority. "That's enough." The voice snapped the air like a whip, and all three men turned in unison. It was Captain James Matthews, a senior officer in the Trenton Police Department, his towering presence filling the space as he walked briskly toward them. His arrival was like a shot to the heart of the conflict, his command unmistakable. "Clark," Matthews barked, his voice cold and commanding. "Stand down." Officer Clark, pale and nervous, immediately stepped back, his hand dropping from his holster. The authority he had tried to wield shattered in an instant. Matthews turned to Raymond and Kelvin, his tone softening, showing respect. "Gentlemen, is everything all right here?" Kelvin nodded slowly, still keeping a watchful eye on Clark. "I think we're all right now, Captain. But your officer here seemed a little overzealous." The captain's gaze shifted back to Officer Clark, his eyes narrowing in disappointment. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Clark stammered, his bravado gone. I was just checking to see if he belonged here, sir. We've had complaints." Matthews cut him off, incredulous. "Complaints about an elderly man sitting quietly in a public park? You don't harass people for that." Raymond, having remained mostly silent, finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "It's all right, Kelvin," he said quietly. "I don't want any trouble." Kelvin glanced back at him, then met the officer's gaze one last time, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "Sometimes, Ray," he said, "standing up for what's right is exactly the kind of trouble we need." The tension broke, but the moment would stay with them all. It was a reminder that sometimes, the quietest moments could spark the loudest revolutions. The frustration in his voice was undeniable, like a crack in the calm, as he spoke. "I've been coming to this park for 30 years, Captain," his words laced with an edge. His eyes locked onto Clark's, the challenge palpable in the air. "Never had a problem until today." Matthews, his own frustration barely contained, gave a terse nod. And you shouldn't have had one today, he snapped, his voice hardening, the weight of authority in his words unmistakable. This was not how things were supposed to unfold. This is not how we do things. He turned to Clark, his voice firm and final. Go back to the station. I'll deal with you later. For a moment, Clark hesitated, his boots grinding against the gravel before he nodded stiffly and walked away. The sound of his steps faded, leaving a silence that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog, the tension lifting but leaving behind an unsettling residue. Matthews turned back to Raymond and Kelvin, his expression softening just slightly, though the remnants of his irritation still clung to him. I apologize for that, he said quietly, his tone an attempt at soothing, though it seemed almost too little too late. That was unacceptable. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Raymond studied the captain for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, with a slight nod he spoke, his voice steady but carrying the weight of experience. I appreciate that, Captain, he acknowledged. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened. And I doubt it'll be the last. Matthews sighed, the weight of his position pressing down on him as he admitted, I know. The words came out with a heaviness that reflected the burden he carried. But I'm working on it. We're trying to change things. Kelvin, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice cutting through the air with a quiet intensity. It's going to take more than just trying, Captain. It's going to take action. Real change. Matthews nodded in agreement, his expression hardening with resolve. You're right, he said, the words carrying a weight that felt like a promise. And I promise you things will change. I'll make sure of it. Raymond's gaze shifted toward the park, his body still tense, his voice calm but carrying a deep, weary resonance. I hope so, he murmured, the words more of a prayer than a statement. I really hope so. The park around them had fallen still again, the confrontation a distant memory now, but the unease lingered like an invisible shadow, refusing to fade completely. Matthews watched Officer Clark disappear down the path, his chest tight as he exhaled deeply, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. This was not unfamiliar territory for him. He'd seen struggles like this before. He had been on the force long enough to know the reality of what his community faced. Raymond, Matthews began, using the older man's first name in a sign of familiarity, his voice softening. I know this can't fix what just happened, but I want you to know that we're not all like that. Clark, he's new. He's still learning. The words fell flat even as he spoke them, a hollow attempt at justification. Raymond didn't answer immediately, his eyes distant, lost in the vastness of the park he had spent countless mornings in. A place of peace, now shattered. He gripped his cane tightly, as though holding on to something to keep him grounded. It's always something, he muttered, more to himself than to Matthews. Always something. Kelvin, standing close by, gave a tight nod, his voice firm but quiet. It's not just about learning, Captain. It's about understanding. Clark's not just new. He came in here already thinking he knew what to expect from us. That's the problem. Matthews shifted uncomfortably, the truth in Kelvin's words landing hard. He knew. There was a culture, a legacy within the department, one that had been passed down long before he ever put on the badge. And changing it would be no easy task. But Matthews wasn't the type to shy away from a challenge. I'm not going to make excuses for him, Matthews said, his tone taking on a new resolute edge. He'll face consequences for this, I assure you. And more than that, we'll be implementing new training. It won't just be for Clark either. Raymond remained silent, his body still tense, but his voice was calm when he spoke again. Training, huh? He let out a quiet, bitter chuckle. You think training is going to change what's in his heart? Matthews didn't respond immediately. He had heard that question before, countless times from men like Raymond, from the women in the community who had grown weary of empty promises. The truth, he didn't know if training could fix what was broken, but it was all he could offer in that moment. It's a start, he said finally, though even he wasn't entirely convinced. Raymond sighed, his body seeming to sag with the weight of years, the exhaustion of a life lived in constant struggle. He looked up at Matthews, his eyes tired, filled with the kind of weariness that only a man who had lived through decades of hardship could know. I've seen starts before, Captain, he said softly. I've seen them come and go. What I haven't seen is a finish. Kelvin, watching the exchange with a heavy heart, nodded slowly. He respected Captain Matthews, had known him for years, even before he rose to his current position. But respect didn't blind him to the unresolved issues that remained. He placed a gentle hand on Raymond's shoulder, offering silent support. "I'm going to hold you to that, Captain," Kelvin said, his voice steady but firm. "This can't keep happening." Matthews met Kelvin's gaze. And for the first time, Kelvin saw a glimpse of the man behind the badge. There was fatigue there, yes, but there was also something else: determination. "You have my word," Matthews said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not just saying this to calm things down. We need real change. I'll make sure of it." Raymond, feeling the weight of the morning's events catching up with him, motioned toward the bench. "I think I'm going to sit for a minute." He moved slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement, as he lowered himself back onto the bench where the confrontation had begun. The deep breath he took seemed to carry the weight of everything that had transpired. Kelvin stayed close, glancing at Matthews one last time before sitting beside Raymond. Matthews lingered a moment longer, as if searching for the right words. But in the end, he just gave a respectful nod before walking away. His footsteps echoed in the quiet, but the peace of the park had not returned. It felt different now. The tension hung in the air, like a heavy fog that refused to lift. For a long while neither man spoke. The distant sounds of joggers and birds filled the air, but it was as if a blanket of silence had fallen over them, heavy and unyielding. Raymond stared down at his hands, the lines of his skin mapping out a lifetime of struggle. The park, which had once been his refuge, now felt tainted. "I'm getting too old for this," Raymond finally muttered, his voice low, worn. Kelvin, who had been gazing out at the park, turned to look at his friend. "Ray, you're not too old," he replied softly. "You're just tired. And you've got every right to be." Raymond let out a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Maybe you're right. But it doesn't make it any easier." For years, Raymond had fought battles that no one else seemed to notice: segregation, civil rights, the unrelenting march toward progress. He had seen it all, lived through it all. And yet now, even in his 70s, the same struggles persisted. The faces, the uniforms had changed, but the questions, the suspicions remained. "You know," Raymond began, his voice distant, "when I was young, I used to think that if we just pushed hard enough, if we just kept fighting, we'd get somewhere. Things would be different for the next generation." Kelvin leaned back on the bench, listening quietly. He had heard stories of Raymond's younger years, of marches, protests, the fight for justice. He had always admired the man's resilience. "And things have changed," Raymond continued. "I've seen it. But days like this, they make me wonder. Makes me wonder if we've really come as far as we think." Kelvin didn't respond right away. He let the words hang in the air, heavy with truth. He knew the truth of what Raymond was saying. Progress had been made, but it wasn't enough. "Not yet. Maybe we haven't," Kelvin said finally, his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean we give up." "I don't think you've ever been the type to give up, Ray." Raymond gave a tired smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, I guess not. But it gets harder, Kelvin. Every year it gets harder." Kelvin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know it does. But that's why we keep going. That's why we don't stop. We can't afford to." They sat in silence for a moment, the morning sun warming their faces. The park around them, once filled with the tension of the confrontation, seemed peaceful again for just a brief moment. It was fleeting, but it was there. Then, just as Raymond was about to speak, Kelvin's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and let out a low sigh. "Looks like this is getting around," he muttered, holding up the phone for Raymond to see. On the screen was a local news alert with the headline, "Officer confronts elderly man in park. Community outrage grows." Raymond squinted at the screen, a frown pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Didn't take long, did it?" he muttered. Kelvin shook his head, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "Nothing stays quiet these days. It's probably already trending." Raymond leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes for a moment. "So what now?" he asked quietly. Kelvin didn't have an answer. He didn't know what would happen next. Would it blow over? Or would this become the spark that ignited something bigger? What he did know was that they weren't going to let it slide. We keep going, Kelvin said firmly. We speak up. We make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. Raymond opened his eyes, giving a small nod. All right, he said, his voice steady but quiet. All right. As word spread, the community began to respond. What had started as a quiet confrontation in an empty park was quickly becoming something much larger. By afternoon, whispers had turned into phone calls, and phone calls into online posts. The local news picked up the story, and before long, a small crowd gathered at Grant Park. Raymond stayed away at first, watching from a distance. People arrived, some with signs, others just talking in small groups. He had wanted peace. That was all. Now, though his routine had been upended, it felt surreal. But as he watched, something else stirred inside him. A realization that this was bigger than him. Bigger than all of them. Kelvin stood by his side, silent for a while, then nudged him gently. Looks like people are ready to speak up, he said. Raymond nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. Yeah, guess they are. The crowd had swelled. Taking a deep breath, Raymond stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air like a beacon as the crowd fell into an expectant silence. He wasn't here for a fight. No, not today. I didn't come here today looking for a fight, he said, his words measured, deliberate. Each syllable seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. I came here for peace, just like I do every morning. But sometimes peace isn't enough. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching for the words that would carry the weight of his message. What he was about to say wasn't easy. It never was. He could see the faces before him, worn by their own struggles, their own silent battles. We've all been through this before, he continued, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of pain. We've all had moments where we were questioned, doubted, judged, not for who we are, but because of the color of our skin. His voice broke slightly, but he pushed on. And it's exhausting. The words lingered in the air, thick with shared experience, as the crowd absorbed them in a deep, resonant silence. Raymond could feel their stories echoing back at him from their eyes. They knew. They knew the weariness, the constant fight, the unspoken understanding that the battle was far from over. A battle they hadn't chosen, but one they had no choice but to endure. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't planned to be standing here, but there was no turning back now. I'm tired, Raymond said, his voice quieter now, though still carrying across the park, carrying the truth of a lifetime. Tired of being questioned. Tired of having to prove I belong. His words hit with the weight of history. Decades spent in this very neighborhood, raising his children, watching the park grow, watching it thrive, only to be made to feel like an outsider in a place he had helped shape. A small wave of anger flickered in his usually calm eyes as he scanned the crowd. His gaze landed on familiar faces, all of them tightened with shared understanding. That young officer, he said, his words sharp. He saw me sitting here, and decided I didn't belong. Why? Because I was sitting in a park. Well, black. The anger rose in him now, flashing across his demeanor, a storm breaking through his calm. I've seen this too many times, he continued, shaking his head. I saw it in the 60s. And now, here we are. Nothing's changed. The crowd murmured in agreement, frustration rippling through them like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about Raymond. No, this was about all of them. About a system that had systematically targeted their community without reason, without justification. And they were done. Kelvin stepped up beside Raymond, offering quiet support. Raymond paused, collecting his thoughts, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. We're tired, he said, his voice growing stronger. But we can't stop. Every time something like this happens, it takes a piece of us. But it also lights a fire. The crowd seemed to pulse with energy as his words sunk in. There was a shift, a sense that this wasn't just another complaint, another moment of silence. No, this was different. This was a movement. We've been through too much to let this slide, Raymond continued, his voice rising, each word building on the last. If we let this go, what's stopping them from coming after the next person? Or the one after that? The crowd's energy was palpable now, crackling with determination, with the kind of urgency that only comes from having reached the breaking point. What had started as a quiet gathering was turning into something much larger, something more powerful than any one person could have imagined. Kelvin took another step forward, his presence adding strength to the moment. "We all know what needs to happen," he said, his voice resolute. "We can't just wait for the system to fix itself. We need to demand that it be fixed. And that starts right here. Right now." A young woman from the crowd stepped forward, her voice steady but fierce. "We've had enough talks. How do we make them listen?" Raymond and Kelvin exchanged a glance, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Protests, petitions, discussions, these had all been tried before. But they also knew that doing nothing was no longer an option. "We've got to show up," Kelvin said, his voice firm, unwavering. "They need to see that we won't be silent anymore. We demand accountability. We demand better." The crowd began to buzz with excitement, voices rising, plans forming. Some had been involved in organizing before. But for others, this was new, born from frustration, driven by the desire to see real change. As the energy swelled, Raymond felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Kelvin sensed the shift in Raymond's mood and placed a hand on his shoulder, offering silent reassurance. "We're not doing this alone, Ray," he said quietly. "Look around. People are ready." Raymond nodded, a small but sincere smile crossing his face. "I know. It's time." The next few days were a blur. Word of the incident spread quickly, and soon, the whole city of Trenton was buzzing with talk of the confrontation in Grant Park. People weren't just angry about what had happened to Raymond. They were angry about the systemic pattern of racial profiling and harassment that had been quietly festering beneath the surface for far too long. Kelvin, alongside a group of community organizers, wasted no time. They called meetings, sent emails, met with local leaders. They planned a rally, one that wouldn't just highlight Raymond's experience. It would spotlight the experiences of everyone in the community who had faced discrimination, who had felt the sting of injustice. Raymond wasn't sure he wanted to be at the center of it all. He had never been one for the spotlight, not even in his younger days. But Kelvin had insisted, and deep down, Raymond knew this wasn't just about him. If his experience could shine a light on the broader issues his community had been fighting for years, then it was worth it. When the day of the rally arrived, Grant Park was a different place. It was no longer a quiet space. It was alive, filled with hundreds of people. Signs were held high, each one reading powerful messages like "Justice for all," "We belong," and "No more silence." The air was thick with determination, the kind of energy that signals something has shifted, that something is about to change. Raymond stood near the front of the crowd, leaning on his cane, taking it all in. He could feel the electricity in the air. This was more than just a rally. This was a movement. This was their chance to finally be heard. Kelvin was beside him, speaking to the organizers, preparing to address the crowd. "This is bigger than us now," he said, turning to Raymond. "This is about the whole city, the whole country." Raymond nodded. The weight of it all was starting to sink in. He never imagined that something so personal could spark a movement this powerful. Looking around at the faces in the crowd, young and old, black and white, he couldn't help but be reminded of the marches he had participated in all those years ago. The fight, it seemed, had never ended. And here they were again, fighting the same battles. A young woman stepped up to the microphone first, her voice clear and strong, introducing the rally. She spoke of the importance of standing together, of holding the system accountable. She called for justice, not just for Raymond, but for everyone who had been unfairly targeted. When it was Raymond's turn to speak, the crowd fell into a heavy silence. All eyes were on him. He approached the microphone, his cane tapping lightly against the stage, and took in the sea of faces before him. Then, with a deep breath, he began. "I've been here before," Raymond said, his voice strong, echoing across the park. "I've stood in front of crowds just like this, fighting for the same things we're fighting for today. And I'll be honest with you, it's exhausting." The crowd murmured in agreement, their shared weariness palpable. But Raymond wasn't finished. "But we can't stop," he continued. "We can't let our exhaustion silence us. Because if we do, nothing changes. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of waiting for change that never comes." He looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had gathered to hear him. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about our children, Our grandchildren. It's about making sure they don't have to fight these same battles. A swell of applause erupted, but Raymond pushed forward, his words coming faster now, fueled by his passion. We're here because we deserve better. We deserve to be treated with respect, with dignity. And if we don't demand it, then who will? The applause grew louder, and for a moment, Raymond felt the weight of the years lift from his shoulders. He wasn't done fighting, not yet. And neither was the community standing beside him. As the rally came to a close, the organizers began discussing the next steps. There would be no letting the momentum fade. They would push forward, demanding real change, real accountability. The fight had only just begun. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Captain Matthews, who had been observing from the edge, made his way over to Raymond and Kelvin. That was powerful, he said, his voice serious. And I want you to know I'm listening. Kelvin nodded, his expression cautious but hopeful. That's a start, Captain. But we need more than just listening. Matthews met his gaze, his voice firm. I know. I've already started making changes within the department. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're committed to making this right. Raymond studied Matthews for a moment before nodding. It's a long road, Captain, but we'll hold you to that. Matthews offered his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Raymond took it. It was a small gesture, but a significant one. A first step toward rebuilding trust, toward forging a path of change. The weeks that followed were filled with action, with hope, with determination. Raymond had become an unexpected voice for the movement. He wasn't looking for the spotlight, but he knew that the fight wasn't about him. It was about the community, about creating real change. As Raymond and Kelvin sat together in Grant Park once more, watching the sunset over the trees, Raymond couldn't help but feel a sense of optimism he hadn't known in years. We've still got a long way to go, Raymond said quietly. But for the first time in a long time, I think we're headed in the right direction. Kelvin smiled, leaning back on the bench. Yeah, Ray. We are. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, they knew the fight wasn't over. But the community was stronger than ever. Together, they were ready to make a difference. Meetings were held everywhere. Local churches, community centers, and even the homes of organizers who desperately wanted to ensure that every voice would be heard. Raymond found himself at the heart of it all, thrust into the center of a movement he hadn't anticipated, nor, frankly, had he wanted. At his age, he'd expected to leave the fighting to the younger generation. But there he was, once again standing on the front lines, advocating for change. One morning, as Raymond sat on his usual bench in Grant Park, soaking in the stillness of the early day, a woman approached him. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, wearing a plain green hoodie and jeans, her curly hair pulled into a messy bun. Raymond had seen her at the rallies before, always quietly standing at the back, listening intently but never speaking. Her name was Anita. Mr. Brooks? She asked softly, her voice carrying a blend of respect and hesitation. Raymond blinked, squinting against the early morning sun as he looked up from his paper. Yes, that's me. She shifted uncomfortably on her feet, clearly nervous. I've been coming to the rallies, listening, she began, her voice faltering. I'm not really the type to speak up, but... She paused, collecting her thoughts. I wanted to thank you. Raymond set his paper aside, giving her his full attention. Thank me for what? For standing up, she continued, her voice gaining strength. For giving us a voice. I didn't think people like me would be heard. But you, and Mr. Kelvin, you've been doing this for so long. Now it feels like maybe things can change. A tired smile tugged at Raymond's lips. It was the kind of smile that came from a lifetime of fighting. A smile that knew the struggle all too well. It's not just me, he said, shaking his head. It's all of us. You're part of this too. Every voice matters, even the quiet ones. Anita looked down, her emotions visible in the way she fidgeted. I didn't think anyone would care what I had to say. I mean, who am I, right? Just some girl working 2 jobs, trying to make ends meet. I didn't think I'd make a difference. Raymond shook his head gently, his voice firm. That's where you're wrong. Every person in this fight makes a difference. You're just as important as anyone else standing up. Don't doubt that for a moment. They sat in silence for a while, the park coming alive around them. People beginning their morning walks, jogs, and routines. Anita's posture relaxed, her shoulders loosening as she took in his words. She didn't have to have all the answers to be part of something bigger. I want to help, she said after a long pause, her voice steadier now. But I don't know where to start. Raymond chuckled softly, a warm sound in the crisp morning air. No one knows where to start. We all just figure it out along the way. Meanwhile, across town, Kelvin had been hard at work with the core group of community leaders, hammering out the details for their next major step, an upcoming public forum with city officials, police representatives, and concerned citizens. They wanted transparency. They wanted real accountability. The promises they were hearing from people like Captain Matthews couldn't just fade away once the media coverage died down. The forum was set to take place in the local high school auditorium. Large enough to hold a few hundred people, it was neutral ground, a place where both the community and city officials could come together to have a real conversation. On the night of the forum, the auditorium was packed. People stood in the aisles, sat cross-legged on the floor, and filled every corner of the room. Raymond stood near the front with Kelvin, who was holding a clipboard, furrowing his brow in concentration as he went over the night's agenda. You ready for this, Ray? Kelvin asked, glancing up at him. Raymond shrugged, leaning on his cane as his eyes scanned the crowd. Ready or not, here we are. Kelvin smiled, his tone laced with a touch of reassurance. That's the spirit. The forum opened with introductions from the city council members. Each spoke briefly about their dedication to improving the community, promising that the events at Grant Park wouldn't happen again. But the crowd was restless. They were waiting for real answers, real solutions. When Captain Matthews took the stage, a murmur rippled through the crowd. People weren't sure what to expect from him. He'd been at the rally promising change, but promises weren't enough anymore. They wanted action. I know why you're all here, Matthews began, his voice steady, yet burdened with responsibility. You're here because the trust between this community and the police department has been broken. And that's on us. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. What happened to Mr. Brooks should never have happened. And we're committed to making sure it never happens again. There was a brief silence as he allowed the crowd to process his words. Some nodded quietly, while others crossed their arms, waiting for more. Matthews continued, We've already started implementing new training for all of our officers. Training that focuses on de-escalation, community engagement, and most importantly, understanding the history and context of the communities we serve. It's not enough just to know the law. Officers need to know the people they're protecting. The crowd shifted slightly, some of the tension easing. But the skepticism was still there. They wanted more than just words. A hand shot up from the back of the auditorium. Training's fine. But how do we know this isn't just another round of empty promises? The voice echoed through the room. What are you actually going to do to hold officers accountable when they step out of line? The room fell silent. All eyes were on Captain Matthews. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the gravity of the question. That's a fair point, he admitted. And it's not just about training. We're creating a civilian oversight board. People from this community, who will have direct access to police reports, body camera footage, and the ability to hold officers accountable. We can't police ourselves if the community doesn't trust us. This board will ensure transparency. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, this time in support. People were skeptical, sure, but the idea of real oversight, a system where they could hold officers directly responsible, was something they hadn't expected to hear. Raymond exchanged a glance with Kelvin, sitting near the front. That's more than I thought they'd offer, Raymond whispered. Kelvin nodded. It's a start. But the night wasn't over yet. More hands went up. More questions were asked. People shared their personal stories of run-ins with police officers. Moments of fear, humiliation. Matthews stayed on the stage, taking it all in. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deflect. By the end of the night, it was clear the forum had only scratched the surface. This was going to be a long process. But there was a sense of something new in the air. A sense that the conversation was starting. As the crowd began to disperse, Raymond and Kelvin lingered near the stage, talking with a few city officials. Captain Matthews approached them, looking weary but determined. Raymond, Kelvin, he greeted them, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I know this isn't enough. I know there's more work to be done. But we're committed to doing it. Kelvin extended his hand, shaking Matthews's firmly. We'll hold you to that, Captain. And if you need our help, you know where to find us. Matthews smiled faintly. I'll take you up on that. We need voices like yours if we're going to make this work. Raymond watched the exchange, feeling something shift inside him. He'd seen this before. Promises of change, promises of progress. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the exhaustion in Matthews's eyes. The weariness of a man who knew the system he worked in was flawed, but was finally ready to admit it. Or maybe it was the crowd. The people who'd come together, not just to demand answers, but to help find them. As the night drew to a close, Raymond and Kelvin walked out of the auditorium together, the crisp night air wrapping around them. They didn't speak for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Raymond broke the silence. You think this will really change anything? Kelvin glanced at him, his face serious but hopeful. I think it's a start, Ray. I really do. Raymond nodded slowly, still turning over everything he had heard. He'd spent so much of his life fighting for change, wondering if it was worth it. But then he remembered the faces in the crowd, the voices of the young people standing up and demanding to be heard. And he knew deep down that it was worth it. It had to be. In the weeks that followed the forum, the Civilian Oversight Board was established. It didn't take long for the community to get involved. People from all walks of life signed up to be part of it, to help oversee the changes being implemented in the police department. Raymond found himself more involved than he had expected. He thought the forum would be the end of his public role, that he could step back and let the younger generation take over. But his phone kept ringing, and every time Kelvin or one of the other organizers called, he couldn't say no. You've still got work to do, Kelvin had told him one afternoon, as they sat together in Grant Park. You're the heart of this movement. Raymond laughed it off, brushing away the compliment, but deep down he knew Kelvin was right. He still had a role to play. Maybe it wasn't the role he'd expected at this point in his life, but it was important. And if he could help guide the next generation, then he wasn't going to stop now. One day, as Raymond sat on his bench watching the park fill with people, he thought back to the day it had all begun. The moment with Officer Clark. That moment had been one in a long line of similar ones throughout his life. But this time, something had changed. The community had rallied, and for once, it felt like their voices were being heard. Anita appeared again, her familiar green hoodie blending into the park's backdrop as she approached. She smiled shyly, sitting beside him in the same spot she had weeks earlier. You're becoming a regular, Raymond teased, his eyes twinkling with warmth. Anita laughed softly, nodding. Yeah, I guess I am. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the world go by. There was peace here, a kind of peace Raymond hadn't felt in a long time. And it wasn't just because the park was quiet. It was because, for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. I think I'm ready, Anita said suddenly, her voice steady but soft. Raymond turned to her, his curiosity piqued. Ready for what? To speak up, she said. To really be a part of this. I've been watching from the sidelines for too long. I think it's time. Raymond smiled, his heart swelling with pride. You'll do just fine, he said. I know it. And as the sun began to set over Grant Park, casting a warm golden light over the trees and paths, Raymond felt something new, a sense of completion. He knew the road ahead was still long, still full of challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was walking it alone. And that was enough for now.